Up next in the broadcast, ahead of President Park's speech to the UN General Assembly, North Korea's human rights situation is in the spotlight on the sidelines. In his address to the UN, U.S. President Barack Obama is expected to defend the recent airstrikes against Islamic State targets in Syria. And Samsung Electronics puts high hopes on the launch of its new Note 4 phablet amid toughening competition in the smartphone sector. Primetime News begins now. Welcome to the program. You're watching Primetime News live from Seoul. I'm Sean Lim.
And I'm Kang Chery. Thanks for joining us tonight. For the first time since taking office last year, President Park Geun-hye will make her diplomatic debut at the UN General Assembly.
In her address, the South Korean leader will likely focus on efforts to prepare the two Koreas for unification. Our Choi You-sun takes us through the president's schedule for day 2 at the UN.
President Park Geun-hye's UN General Assembly address is widely expected to lay out the details of her vision for unification of the Korean peninsula and seeking international support for the plan. Back in March, the South Korean leader proposed the two Koreas increase Seoul's humanitarian support to Pyongyang and people-to-people exchanges as an initial step towards preparing for reunification. She has even launched a committee in the South to get ready for the unprecedented process. President Park will also likely talk about rebuilding inter-Korean trust to resolve the North Korean nuclear weapons issue and to bring peace and prosperity to Northeast Asia and Eurasia. It's also possible she might touch on the North's human rights abuses. Aside from the peninsula's security and foreign policy issues, the president will highlight Korea's contributions to other global issues as a major middle power. At the U.S.-led Security Council meeting on foreign terrorist fighters, a mounting issue of concern in the Middle East, President Park is expected to stress the need for international cooperation to counter the phenomenon of foreigners joining Islamist extremist groups. She will also announce ways that Korea is willing to help in the global fight, which will likely be in the form of humanitarian assistance. At a high-level meeting on global education presided over by the UN Secretary-General, President Park will speak about Korea's education system and vow to work to advance education worldwide ahead of next year's World Education Forum in Korea. Choi You-sun, Arirang News, New York.
The heads of states from around the world agreed with President Park Geun-hye's vision for climate change, for its fight for climate change. Leaders, including U.S. President Barack Obama, highlighted the need to start dealing with this issue now rather than later. Kim Hyun-bin reports.
With the threat of Islamic State militants and the spread of Ebola in West Africa competing for attention, the United Nations is also setting its sights on climate change. The UN has given 125 countries and their representatives at the General Assembly a platform to explain their plans to address the problem. U.S. President Barack Obama stressed the need for emerging economies to make stronger commitments and move past the rich-poor divide that has created a barrier in UN negotiations.
And today I call on all countries to join us, not next year or the year after that, but right now. Because no nation can meet this global threat alone.
Before taking the podium, Obama met with China's Vice Premier Zhang Gaoli. The two agreed that both of their countries needed to take more responsibility in the fight against climate change, as they represent the world's two biggest greenhouse gas emitters. Zhang said China would aim to cap emissions as soon as possible. British Prime Minister David Cameron said his country is aiming to cut down greenhouse emissions by 80% by the year 2050 and to push the European Union to target a 40% reduction by 2030. French President François Hollande said his country will inject $1 billion into the Green Climate Fund. Most other leaders did not disclose specific plans, choosing instead to unveil them closer to the start of the UN Climate Change Conference in Paris in December of 2015. Kim Hyun-bin, Arirang News.
And staying in New York, a meeting on North Korea's human rights violations took place on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly. Officials from Seoul, Washington, and Tokyo pointed to the atrocious abuses taking place under the North Korean regime and urged Pyongyang to close down its prison camps. But will their efforts spark any changes? Our Hwang Sung-hee has more.
The UN Commission of Inquiry says North Korea uses prison camps, systematic oppression, and arbitrary executions against its own citizens. Practices that U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry says hold no place in the 21st century.
So we say to the North Korean government, all of us here today, you should close those camps. You should shut this evil system down.
Kerry hosted the first ever ministers' meeting on North Korean human rights Tuesday to draw attention to the findings of a UN report released in February. It estimates that some 120,000 political prisoners are currently being held in 4 major labor camps, where starvation, torture, and forced abortions are rampant. South Korean Foreign Minister Yoon Byung-se hopes for further progress on the issue.
Later this year, I look forward to the General Assembly adopting a more robust resolution on this issue, including measures on accountability.
Yoon proposed discussing the issue with the North, an offer that will likely be rejected. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un claims his people enjoy the world's most advantageous human rights system, but the diplomatic pressure on Pyongyang is mounting.
Japan is determined to play an active role to ensure that these efforts will lead North Korea to take concrete action toward resolving human rights abuses in North Korea.
Human rights watchers say coordination with Pyongyang's chief ally China is needed to some extent, which remains a challenge. Hwang Sung-hee, Arirang News.
While the North Korean regime it says it's aiming to boost its economy by attracting foreign investors as well as tourists, many of its own people are suffering from a lack of even the most basic necessities, food. According to the World Food Program, the average daily portion of food distributed to North Korean citizens was 250 grams in August. This is a 3-year low and doesn't even account for half the amount that the North Korean regime has set as its goal.
Phablet fans will be able to get Samsung Electronics' new Galaxy Note 4 here in Korea on Friday, and the tech giant is pinning high hopes on the release. But analysts and investors have had a more muted response to the company lately. Kwon So-hwa explains how the success of this newest gadget alone will not get the company back on its feet.
Samsung boasts an even better version of the S Pen stylus for its latest phablet Galaxy Note 4. And it's kept a 5.7-inch screen size, which is larger than the 5.5 inches on Apple's new iPhone 6 Plus. Whether they'll be enough to win the fight against Apple's larger-sized iPhones remains a question.
It won't be easy to overcome the difficulties for the time being. The release of one product is not going to help Samsung turn around in the short term.
And the market's reaction has resonated similar questions. Around $60 billion have been wiped off the market value of Samsung Electronics since January last year. Its market capitalization is at the lowest level since July 2012. Meanwhile, its arch-rival Apple is enjoying the record-breaking 10 million sales of its new iPhone 6 and iPhone 6 Plus models, which was reached just 3 days into its release.
Well, the speculation out there is that Apple's preparing to sell between 770 and 80 million iPhones this holiday season, and this would be up from 50 to 60 million in the prior holiday season.
Chinese players like Xiaomi have also emerged as a growing threat. The company sold more smartphones in China than Samsung in the second quarter of the year. This could explain Samsung's decision to release its latest phablet in China before any other overseas market, marking a first for the Korean tech giant. Kwon So-ah, Arirang News.
The Korean government is looking to give domestic manufacturers a few more reasons to bring their overseas plants back home. The Trade Ministry says it's looking to change laws on Korea's free trade zones that allow easier access to returning companies. There are currently 13 designated free trade zones, which provide firms various benefits such as tax breaks. About 60 local companies have reportedly agreed to bring their production facilities back since 2012, while a dozen others are committed to doing the same over the next 4 years. The government will push ahead with hotly contested telemedicine services this month, which will give patients in remote areas and those who require frequent monitoring the luxury of receiving treatment at home. But it won't be a full launch. A pilot program will test the waters first. Kim Ji-yeon has this report.
This patient has been suffering from high blood pressure for 15 years now and requires continuous medical examinations and care. But instead of visiting the hospital every day, he sends his health-related data, such as blood pressure and body composition, from his personal computer at home. Then the patient calls his doctor for one-on-one treatment.
마지막으로 병원 다녀오신 지는 언제세요?
한 일주일이요?
네.
The government is testing this telemedical service on 1,200 patients at 11 medical centers across Korea. The health ministry expects that around 8.5 million people nationwide will benefit.
Patients that are in remote regions such as islands and mountainous locations are expected to benefit the most, as well as patients with chronic diseases that require continuous monitoring of their physical conditions.
Through a special transmitter device, patients send health information to their doctor on a daily basis or a few times a week, depending on their condition. The doctor assesses the data received and consults with the patient at least once a week. Only when the patient asks for an alteration in their medication or when their condition worsens will they be required to make a physical visit to the closest medical center. The pilot program, which begins this month and runs until March of next year, will be reviewed and evaluated along the way by a committee composed of medical and IT experts. Kim Ji-yeon, Arirang News.
It's no longer unusual for Koreans to look for work after retirement to support themselves, but finding a job in your golden years is no easy task. So that's perhaps why the government is trying to lend a helping hand. Hwang Ji-hye tells us more.
The elderly line up for a job fair. They're people who are approaching retirement or already have but are seeking employment again.
I'm very confident in human resources and financial affairs. Managerial positions would be preferable, but I can also be a hands-on worker or anything else.
Yi is one of many Korean salary workers who are forced into retirement in their mid-50s and then struggle to eke out a living for the next 2 or 3 decades. To help remove the uncertainties post-retirement, the Korean government on Wednesday unveiled a package it believes will eventually help boost much-needed domestic spending. The package is aimed at lengthening the employment of salary workers. One way to achieve the goal is limiting wage gains for older employees.
We will expand subsidies for companies that introduce a wage peak system.
The government will also provide career designing services for people over 50. To encourage companies to introduce such schemes, the government will offer subsidies of about $1,000 for each employee who takes such vocational training run by their employers. The finance ministry says many retirees have had to set up restaurants or mom-and-pop stores with their life savings to make sure they have a steady flow of income. But many end up facing bankruptcy due to intense competition, with nearly 2/3 of such businesses failing within 3 years. The hardships of retirees have often been blamed for the delayed recovery in domestic spending, and the government hopes the new programs will help end the chronic problem. Hwang Ji-hye, Arirang News.
The Korean film industry is becoming more diverse than ever. There are a growing number of independent films that are grabbing the audience's attention. Our Shin Se-min reports on one such indie film that has made waves at the film festivals around the world.
The life of an ordinary 70-year-old woman who's traveled a rough road growing up in the tranquil city of Suncheon in Korea's South Jeollanam-do province, the documentary, Splendid But Sad Days, invites audiences to her story as a wife, a mother, and a fisherwoman who's devoted her whole life to support her family. This independent film had its premiere on the silver screen in Seoul on Tuesday for eager audience members who've been waiting for their chance to see the film. The 64-minute documentary has been highly praised by international audiences throughout the film festival circuit, including the Busan International Film Festival, Focus Korea of France, and the Montreal World Film Festival.
International audiences commented on the film's ability to capture the unfiltered life of a woman who gave up everything for her family. It also shows aspects of Korea's traditional culture. I'm glad the film was able to present this side of Korea.
Cinemagoers are saying that independent films like this have more of an effect on them compared to commercial hits.
I think the film will linger in my mind for days. It made me want to search for more independent films that can touch my emotions like this.
While the local documentary scene is small, the genre is growing. The independent film Old Partner, released in 2008, posted ticket sales of over 2.9 million. Splendid But Sad Days will be shown in selected theaters starting in Suncheon from Thursday. Shin Se-min, Arirang News.
U.S. President Barack Obama has hailed American and Arab airstrikes against Islamic State targets in Syria, saying it's only the first step in the campaign against the militant group.
With more, we turn to Paul Yee at the News Center. Paul, this is a rare partnership between U.S. and Arab leaders. What other remarks did Obama have on the joint military action?
Well, speaking at the White House ahead of his address at the UN General Assembly, Obama stressed that the fight against Islamic State isn't America's alone. He added that support from those Arab nations proves that the world is committed to destroying the terrorist threat. Our Connie Kim reports.
Speaking out after the first airstrikes against Islamic State militants in Syria, U.S. President Barack Obama said that Washington was proud to stand shoulder to shoulder with its Arab allies. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Jordan, Bahrain, and Qatar have partnered up with Washington for the first time since the first Gulf War in 1991 to counter the growing threat.
Well, it is a wonderful opportunity for me to welcome these leaders, friends, partners from the region, and to say thank you to all of them for their participation and commitment to rolling back the violent extremism that has so disrupted Iraq and Syria and threatens the region as a whole.
More than 200 airstrikes were launched against a dozen targets in the offensive, much of it in or around the Islamic State's self-declared capital of Raqqa. Activists on the ground said some 70 IS militants and 50 al-Qaeda-linked fighters were killed in the first set of strikes Tuesday. The offensive in Syria is an expansion of a campaign that began in Iraq last month. Prior to the airstrikes on IS targets, the U.S. launched separate airstrikes on a group of senior al-Qaeda officials known as the Khorasan Group in Syria. U.S. officials say they were plotting attacks against the West and had established a safe haven west of the city of Aleppo. Connie Kim, Arirang News.
And turning to West Africa, a new report by a U.S. agency shows the number of Ebola cases in West Africa could dramatically soar up to 1.4 million by the end of January. The U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention said Tuesday the estimate for the countries of Liberia and Sierra Leone is partly based on the premise that Ebola infections are vastly underreported. Meanwhile, the World Health Organization says the economies of West Africa are facing tremendous hardship, worrying the crisis will get far worse before it gets better.
We are now in the third explosive phase of growth of the epidemic. This is exponential increase with hundreds going into thousands of cases per week. And if we don't stop the epidemic very soon, this is going to turn from a disaster into a catastrophe.
Latest figures from the WHO show over 5,800 infections and over 2,800 deaths in West Africa due to the latest and worst Ebola outbreak on record. And returning to Asia, some 16,000 demonstrators have rallied in Japan in protest of the government's push to restart the country's nuclear reactors, despite a heavy anti-nuclear sentiment. According to Kyodo News Agency, the protesters gathered in the park in the Japanese capital on Tuesday to voice their opposition of the move, which could come as early as this winter. Among those in the crowd was Nobel laureate Oze Kenzaburo, who accused Tokyo of planning to restart the reactors without enough testing. Others argue that the nation's disaster response plans are still insufficient, more than 3.5 years since the Fukushima meltdown. Earlier this month, Japan's nuclear watchdog had cleared a restart of 2 reactors at the Sendai nuclear power plant, the first among the country's 48 idling reactors. And finally, India is celebrating its first successful space mission to Mars, marking the first country to do so on its maiden voyage. After traveling more than 600 million kilometers over the span of 10 months, the Mars Orbiter mission established a stable orbit around the red planet on Wednesday. India now joins the U.S., Europe, and former Soviet Union in successfully launching a spacecraft to Earth's neighbor. Speaking at Mission Control in Bangalore, Prime Minister Narendra Modi said India had achieved the impossible.
History has been created today. We have dared to reach out into the unknown and have achieved the near impossible. I congratulate all ISRO scientists as well as all my fellow Indians on this historic occasion.
The robotic probe will begin scanning Mars's atmosphere for traces of methane, which may provide evidence of life. The landmark space mission has also been praised for its low cost of $74 million. In comparison, NASA's Maven probe, which reached Mars on Sunday, cost over $670 million. And that wraps up our look at international headlines, making news around the world. I'll see you back here tomorrow night.
Hello and welcome to Wednesday's Asian Games updates. And we start with fencing. Korea showed, or rather continued to show off its fencing prowess as the hosts grabbed gold in women's team foil and the men's team saber. Ladies held a slim lead over China before Jeon Hee-suk ran away with her bout 5-0 to ensure the team victory. Meanwhile, the men were dominant against Iran, winning by a score of 45-26 for their first gold since 2002 and third in Asian Games history. Now let's put our sights on the shooting competition, where the South Korean men and women hit their marks for several top finishes. It started with the 25-meter rapid pistol qualification, where the men combined forces for the team gold. At the same time, the women got down to business in the 50-meter rifle prone position, winning the gold there as well. Then back to the men's 25-meter rapid pistol. Kim Jun-hong's accurate strafing earned him an individual gold medal as well. And more good news for South Korea, this time over at the Tangum Lake Rowing Center in Chungju, where Kim Ye-ji powered her way to an historic win in the singles scull. And Kim glided across the finish line more than 13 seconds ahead of Hong Kong's Lee Ka-man for a time of 8 minutes 46.52 seconds and South Korea's second ever gold in the sport. And moving on, we go to Munhak Stadium for baseball. South Korea and Chinese Taipei met on the diamond. Yang Hyung-jong, he threw 4 scoreless innings with 7 Ks. The Korean Bash brothers from Nexon, Park Geun-hye and Kang Chery homered. Oh Jae-won also hit the long ball. An RBI single in the 8th inning triggered the mercy rule, and South Korea won this one 10-0. And finally, to weightlifting in the women's 69-kilo division, where North Korean Ryo Eun-hee and China's Zhang Yanmei went lift for lift. The North Korean set an Asian Games record in the snatch, but in the clean and jerk, Zhang outlifted Ryo by 9 kilos to set the new Asian Games record in the total score and edge out her rival for the gold. And that wraps it up for Day 5 in Incheon. This has been Stephen Che. Now let's take a look at the medal table and Tuesday's, or rather Thursday's, events. Good night.
Happy Wednesday, I'm Kim Bo-kyung with your weather updates. Rain kicked off the day here in Seoul, and though conditions have cleared up, light drizzles continue to fall along the eastern coastline, and another 5 to 20 millimeters of precipitation will fall in those regions through tomorrow morning. There's also news of strong wind advisories along the southern coast, where winds are blowing at a rate of 15 meters per second. On the bright side, we can look forward to enjoying sunny autumn weather tomorrow. Daytime highs should jump 3 to 4 degrees compared to today, reaching into the high 20s. Otherwise, the rest of the week, that is, looks to be nice for spending time outdoors. Moving on, clear skies are forecast for Incheon, perfect for tomorrow's golf and baseball matches. On to Thursday's readings. Seoul reaches 27, Daegu and Busan 26. On to other places. Daejeon and Jeju hit 25, Dokdo and Mangeumgang low 20s. That's all for now, and back to you guys.
Thanks, Bo-kyung. And that's Primetime News on this Wednesday. I'm Kang Chery. Thanks for watching.
And I'm Sean Lim. Stay tuned for Late Night Edition, and we'll also be bringing you live coverage of the President's address to the UN General Assembly in about 2 hours. We'll see you soon.